Rain misted over the city in a soft, unrelenting hush, turning streetlights into pale halos and leaving the sidewalks slick with a film that seeped through coats and into bones. It was early, before most shops unlocked their doors, before the buses filled, when the world still held its breath, and Mara Ellis stood beneath the awning of a small, reproductive health clinic, her collar pulled up against the drizzle, feeling as if the rain itself had found a way inside her chest. She had not slept in days. The night after the hearing had been a long, hollow vigil, staring at the ceiling, replaying the courtroom like a broken recording. Faces and phrases flickered. The judge's half glance, the confident cadence of her husband's lawyer, the way her own counsel had slumped inward as if his spine could fold around the truth and hide it. Her hands trembled as they rested on the slight swell of her abdomen. Twins, the doctor had said months ago, and the idea of two small lives seemed to amplify every fear and every hope until she could not tell which was which. Mara did not want to be here. She did not want the clinic, the clinical word, or the clinical act. Yet the courtroom's verdict had left her with a narrowing corridor of choices, and each door along its length had been latched. The judge, Judge Harmon Kane, had pronounced in a voice that might have been procedural if it hadn't felt surgical, that her husband, Adam, would be granted primary custody once the children were born. The ruling had landed like a verdict from an invisible jury, leaving Mara unmoored and breathless. She had tried to tell it all that day, the way Adam's moods shifted from charming to small, sharp cruelty, the manipulations threaded through conversations and bank statements, the nights she woke to find herself rearranging the words in her head until they meant nothing. Her attorney had pushed back sparingly, a few quiet objections swallowed by the judge's impatience. The courtroom's air had tasted of old coffee and the thin linen of power, and when the gavel finally fell, it sounded less like justice than like a sealed box. Now, with the clinic door a few feet away, Mara stepped forward and then stopped. A voice, raspy, oddly steady, cut through the rain and anchored itself to her name. "Don't go in there, sweetheart." The voice came from a woman perched on the low concrete wall by the entrance, bundled in mismatched layers and holding a paper cup to warm her shaking hands. Her hair was a silver halo beneath a ragged hood. Her face was folded into fine lines, but her eyes were sharp as if made by glass. Mara stared, startled. The woman nodded as though she had expected the question forming behind Mara's lips. "He didn't see straight for you," the woman murmured. "Someone paid him off." The words landed like a stone in cold water. Mara had suspected as much in the quiet corridors of her own mind during the hearing, when a judge's expression eased just a fraction at certain phrases, when her husband's purchases had seemed like trophies more than investments, but she had never voiced it. The woman's certainty felt uncanny and, for a beat, frighteningly specific. Before Mara could speak, the woman rose and shuffled away, slipping into the rain with a nimbleness that betrayed her age. Mara watched her go, the echo of the warning following her all the way home, where the rain lingered in steady threads down the windows. The city kept its low, indifferent hum, and inside her small apartment stacked between a laundromat and a corner deli, Mara felt some internal ledger tilt. She made tea she could not finish and sat with her hands over the small bump that was beginning to show, palms warmed by her own breath. The twins kicked, a faint, sudden flutter, and in that tiny movement something raw and fierce woke inside her. She would not be the kind of mother who folded. She would not hand over everything because a judge with two smooth hands decided it should be so. Her thumb hovered over her phone screen until she found the name she needed. Lila Monroe. They had not spoken in depth for years. Life had bifurcated in the way life does. Mara into early childhood education and part-time classes. Lila into investigative work with a quiet, relentless focus. But Mara remembered how, in college, Lila's gaze bored into whatever fiction someone was presenting and came away with the real thing. She called. When Lila answered, she sounded 5 years older, but tempered by the same steadiness Mara remembered. "Where are you?" Lila asked. The warmth in her voice was a small, steady thing. "Give me 30 minutes. Burnside, Laurel and Pine. I'll be there." The cafe at the corner was the kind that smelled like roasted beans and damp scarves, where baristas knew the regulars by name, and the chairs had long since learned the shape of elbows. Lila arrived with water still clinging to her hair, and when Mara folded into the conversation, at first halting and then rushing, the old friend listened in a way that pulled truth from the tangle. Lila did not offer platitudes or disbelief. She asked careful questions about dates and phrases and tones. When Mara mentioned the woman outside the clinic and the piercing certainty of her voice, Lila's expression shifted in a way that suggested this story was falling into place. "I've seen a pattern like this," Lila said finally. "Not the same pattern, but the shape of it. Judges can be human, and our humans sometimes get dirty. I can look. Quietly. I can see if there's smoke." Mara left the cafe with her hands steadier and a plan taking form. It was not a grand plan. It began with practical steps, an appeal, a request for a judicial review, a push for financial transparency. Lila suggested a lawyer, someone precise, not theatrical, who didn't talk up a fight but mapped one carefully. Mara called, and the lawyer, Clara Rhodes, invited her in. The office Clara kept was small, sunlit, a single fern by the window, and a bookshelf that smelled faintly of old paper and fresh coffee. Clara had the kind of face that signaled a refusal to be bullied, not loud but immovably clear. She asked Mara to start at the beginning, and as Mara spoke, Clara's pen did not pause. The way Clara listened made Mara feel as if a window had been opened inside a room that had been sealed too long. "What we do first is file for reconsideration and an appeal," Clara said. "That will freeze the status quo. Then we push for a review of the judge's recent rulings and request complete disclosure of your husband's finances. If we find a trail, if we can show the connections, we can argue for recusal." The words felt like tools. Mara signed a retainer with hands that trembled not from defeat, but from the alchemy of resolve. She felt the first small, hard shape of hope. Adam did not take the news gently. He called, voice a polished mixture of cold and condescension, asking what made her think a cheap lawyer would change anything. His tone slid into the familiar texture of belittlement. "You're unstable," he intoned in a voicemail. "You can't handle this." He would say things like that. No threats at first, only the slow erosion of confidence and the drip of guilt and doubt. Later, as the motions were filed and Clara began to pull threads through a stubborn legal labyrinth, Adam's tactics grew uglier. There were late-night knocks that silenced Mara's sleep, flurries of text messages that smelled of resentment, disguised as concern, and an urgent voicemail that promised to make everyone see. She was unfit if she didn't relent. It was Lila who reached out next, discreet and urgent. She'd started looking into Judge Kane's docket, she reported, and found a faint, troubling pattern. A handful of rulings seemed to skew strangely in favor of certain parties. Bank records, if you followed the small print, showed transfers that didn't match judicial salaries. It wasn't proof yet. It was smoke. But with smoke, a good lawyer could fan for embers. Clara absorbed Lila's outline and turned it into motion language. She drafted the request for review, a petition for financial disclosure, a motion to reopen the custody evaluation with medical evidence and testimony about Mara's emotional abuse. The motions were precise, their language surgical. Mara felt oddly comforted by the clarity of the work. Fighting a current makes one feel less like a leaf and more like someone with arms in the water. Adam retaliated. He ramped up the intimidation, filings that churned the legal waters and visits to Mara's apartment that made her heart clench in surprise and anger. The pressure manifested in physical ways: nausea that had nothing to do with her pregnancy, sudden cramps that tightened and released like a storm searching for ground. Twice she ended up at the emergency room, where doctors, gentle and blunt in equal measure, told her to minimize stress, to rest, to document anything that might amount to a legal pattern. "Stress is a risk for you," a nurse said, writing notes into a chart that later would become part of a file. Behind Clara's calm, a new presence emerged. Lila called one afternoon and said she had an ally, a detective who could look into financial irregularities unofficially. Mara met Detective Serena Hart in the dim back room of the law office, a woman whose badge was tucked from sight, but whose gaze carried a kind of forensic warmth. Serena set a thin folder on the table. It rattled with the weight of possibility. "We've been tracking transfers that line up suspiciously with a few judicial decisions," Serena said. "It's not public yet. We need to be careful. If this gets out prematurely, everything will be buried." The folder contained enough to make a stomach drop: limited, circumstantial, but coherent. An LLC with no employees, a string of cash deposits and hush payments, and transfers landing in accounts that, when the paper trail was followed, circled close to a web of developers Adam worked with. It was not the slam dunk of a courtroom drama, but it was a hinge. Clara moved quickly. She added the findings to the motion for recusal, framed not as accusation but as reasonable cause for transparency. If the judge had nothing to hide, the documents would not hurt him. If he did, the motion would crack the shell. The court hearing where Clara presented the recusal motion was a pressure cooker. Adam sat at the defendant's table looking immaculate, his attorney like a coiled instrument of suave aggression. Judge Kane, who had always ruled with the comfortable arrogance of someone rarely challenged, shifted when Clara spoke. She did not plead, nor did she shout. She simply laid the documents down with the air of someone who expected the rules to mean something. "You are attempting to impugn this court without cause," Judge Kane said, heat thinly veiled. "We are requesting a review under the statutes that protect a litigant's right to an unbiased tribunal," Clara replied, calm and precise. "If the records show patterns of inappropriate transactions, then recusal is not an attack. It is a constitutional safeguard." There was a pause, and in pauses, truth sometimes reveals itself in the smallest gestures. Kane's fingers twitched. The judge's usual sardonic curl around the mouth loosened. The clerk took the motion under advisement, leaving the room draped in the hush of a moment that had weight. When the gavel sounded, it no longer felt like a closed door slamming. It sounded like a crack opening. Then, the world moved fast. Clara, Lila, and Serena worked in a tight, careful choreography, adding affidavits, documenting Adam's threats, collecting voicemails and messages. Each piece was methodical. The hospital notes about Mara's stress-induced contractions, neighbor testimony about Adam's late-night storms of fury, the receipts tracing unexplained expenditures. In the background, Serena quietly followed financial leads until enough pattern formed that an audit could be requested. Adam responded in the way of men who have relied too long on influence, with anger, with bluster, and with a thin panic that sometimes slips out of collared shirts. He escalated. A voicemail accusing Mara of being unwell, a terse threat that he wouldn't be made a fool, and once a confrontation so intimate and menacing at her apartment door that Mara's neighbor called the police. Each incident was another line in the record. The pressure increased to the point where Mara spent a night gripped by cramps so severe an ambulance rode her through streets that blurred like watercolor. In a triage room, hooked to fetal monitors, her thoughts were a scatter of fear. She did not want the newborns to come early. She did not want to be the kind of woman people pitied. But when Clara called with 2 words, "suspended pending," Mara's relief roared so loud she startled. Judge Kane was suspended. The announcement came like an earthquake through the courthouse grapevine. Clara answered Mara's shaking call at the hospital. "They've pulled him," she said. "There's an investigation." Mara felt the air push out of her like someone had opened a valve. Tears broke loose, a release of weeks of holding as if the body itself couldn't contain the strain any longer. It was not a triumph. The word that came was simpler: unshackling. In the quiet of the hospital room, with monitors beeping and nurses' shoes whispering down the hall, Mara finally let herself breathe the way someone exhales after holding their breath underwater. In the weeks that followed, the wheels of justice had a different rhythm. The recusal motion went through and a new judge, Judge Miriam Calder, took the bench, a jurist whose name carried the kind of reputation that doesn't need to be shouted because it is already known for even, meticulous judgment. Clara presented the case anew, not as an embattled woman clawing at a system, but as a mother whose life had been mapped out against her will, recordings of Adam's verbal abuse, neighbors' accounts, the documentary trace of financial improprieties that linked the developer and the now suspended judge through a network of transfers and shell entities. Nurse reports about the stress that had precipitated early labor were read aloud. The courtroom, relieved of the earlier unspoken bias, listened. Adam tried to claw back control. Witnesses for him stood and made claims of overreaching and drama. His attorney objected with the sharpness of someone used to steering narratives toward doubt. But the combined weight of documentation, the clarity of the medical records, and the meticulous way Clara wove the chronology, dates lining up like a map of cause and effect, undermined the rehearsed confidence Adam had once worn like armor. The ruling, when it came, was firm. In the best interest of the children, Judge Calder announced, custody would be awarded to Mara. Primary physical and legal custody granted to the mother, with Adam granted supervised visitation pending further review. The judge also noted an ongoing criminal inquiry into the former judge's conduct and vacated the orders that had been issued under his purportedly compromised oversight. The sound in the courtroom that day was not celebration. It was the careful exhale of relief, the kind that happens when someone is allowed to stand upright after being bent for too long. For Mara, the ruling felt like the bridge she had spent months fighting to build. Not immaculate, not a silver cure-all, but steady. Adam's world contracted after the hearings. Without the protective sheen of influence, his business interests frayed. The legal storms made partners wary. He retreated into a smaller life, visiting rarely, always under supervision, always with the cool, distant manners of a man who has lost the capacity to charm. Mara's daughters, tiny in their beginning, fragile and resilient, grew into children who laughed loud enough that the house itself seemed to lean into their sound. She rebuilt in careful increments, part-time classes, volunteer hours at the local literacy program, neighborhood drives where she and other parents gathered donations and lesson plans. Her energies were no longer devoured by court filings. They were shaped by bedtime stories and drawing sessions, and the small, mundane miracles of mashed peas and the quiet discovery of a book. Clara remained a presence, an ever-practical force. Lila was a line back to the quiet vigilance that had helped expose the wrong turn in the system. Serena kept an eye on the edges, the way a lighthouse keeps the coastline from being forgotten. These women became, in time, Mara's chosen family, the kind of kinship that forms in the trenches when people stand up for each other. 10 years passed like a long, steady breath. Winters still brought rain that made the maples along Mara's street spill their leaves and confetti, but the sound was gentler now, a lullaby rather than a menace. Her house sat on a street where she knew the names of the neighbors and where her daughters could pedal down the sidewalk without fear. They were not identical save for the way their laughter matched. Each had a distinct presence, One careful and contemplative, the other loud and curious, but both tethered to Mara with a fierce loyalty that desalinated the past's bitterness with ordinary love. There were nights when the old fear rose like a tide, a voicemail from Adam, a fleeting shadow in the periphery of a grocery store. But those tides did not pull her under. She had learned to document, to call, to put words in a file. She had learned, too, to watch for the small signs of joy and to let them land without guilt. In the evenings when the children slept under warm blankets and wind chimes on the porch, saying soft, she would stand in the doorway of their room and breathe in the steady rhythm of their sleep. Her life was not unscarred, but it was whole in a way the courtroom's cold calculus could not account for. Every so often, Mara would think of the woman on the clinic wall, the one who had said flatly, "Someone paid him," and then melted into the rain. Mara had never seen her again. There was no record of her on the avenue, no name to puzzle at. She sometimes imagined her as an odd intersection in the story, a fragment of fate, a coincidence that tilted the scales. In the quiet moments, she wondered whether the woman had been memory rather than person, a dream that pressed her to action. Whatever the truth, that single sentence had been a fulcrum. It had been enough. Time softened the edges of what had happened, but did not erase the lessons. Mara taught her daughters the value of curiosity and the obligation to speak truth, gently and persistently. She told them, in small pieces appropriate to their age, about resilience and how allies can appear in unlikely forms. "There are people who see the whole picture," she would say, "and there are people who hold your hand while you find yours. Keep both." Once, on a damp spring morning, as the girls chased a kite down the hill behind their house, Mara found herself unexpectedly smiling at a memory. Lila's steady gaze across a coffee shop table, Clara's unflinching calm in a courtroom that had smelled at one time like old coffee and worse things, Serena's thin folder sliding across a table, and the hush that followed. She felt gratitude not as a fanfare, but as a warm, brass coin in her palm, scarred but minted anew. One evening, when the twins were 10 and the house hummed with homework and a bowl of pasta cooling on the kitchen counter, Mara went out onto the porch and closed her eyes. The wind chimes tinkled overhead. A neighbor's dog barked distantly. In a dreamscape that had been less lonely than the reality of those months long ago, she saw the old woman once more. This time, the woman's face was not weathered by years, but luminous with something like recognition. "Did you find what you were looking for?" the woman asked, voice like shuffling leaves. Mara did not have to speak. She had already found it, maybe not a tidy end, not an unblemished victory, but a life threaded together of hard work and small mercies. She had found the steadiness that comes from standing again and again on the side of truth. She had found, most crucially, the courage to be a guardian for two loud, tender souls. "Yes," Mara whispered into the night, not to the dream, but to her life. The words fell soft and sure. Behind her, the house glowed with the light of living rooms where voices tumbled and a dog snored gently by the sofa. Inside, her daughters curled under their blankets, safe in the world Mara had insisted on keeping for them. The rain returned in the distance, a familiar percussion, and Mara closed the door on the past with a quietness that was not surrender, but a kind of settling. An acceptance that pain and redemption can coexist, and that sometimes a stranger's sentence in the rain is enough to change everything,